The Gangster Disciples are said to be at least 40,000 strong in numbers and continue to grow with members as young as preteen and members as old as in their 70s. The Gangster Disciple Nation has a hell of a legacy of expansion, power, and dominance. The Gangster Disciples have grown beyond just being a gang and are about growth and development. Growth and development is something positive that turns Gangster Disciple members into productive members of society and helps men of all ages better themselves and become successful. Not all Gangster Disciples get involved in criminal activity, and many retire and leave the criminal life and become productive members of growth and development. The history of the Gangster Disciple Nation has roots that come from civil rights issues and dealing with problems that plagued their communities. It became time to fight back. From the rough parts of Hyde Park to the impoverished and blighted community of Englewood, gangsters and disciples were born and would evolve to show the world true power in numbers and organization. The formation of the gangsters took place in Englewood in the year 1964, more specifically at 68th and Green. A group of 30 young black youths got together at this intersection as they hung out in Larry Hoover's home, and watched outside the window as gangsters and pimps hung out in the parking lot of the Guys and Gals nightclub that used to exist at that intersection. These boys wanted to be just like these pimps and gangsters, and they were living on the border of Ranger and Disciple territory. Larry Hoover was inspired to be a leader of gangsters and began dressing himself very well to fit the role. Eventually, these boys created their own club called the Supreme Gangsters, which was Larry Hoover's idea for the club name. Larry Hoover himself was not the first official leader, but more of a behind-the-scenes type leader. Hoover teamed up with street hustler Andrew D. Howard and King Ike Taylor and made King Ike his right-hand man. The Supreme Gangsters wore the color black, and their symbols were a heart with wings and a round crown with a sword going through it. The Supreme Gangsters saluted each other with a clenched fist as their hand sign. Upon inception, the Supreme Gangsters were immediately at war with Blackstone Rangers and Egyptian Cobras, but had no hard feelings against disciples. Supreme Gangsters were the newer organization in Englewood, and this made them the target of Blackstone Rangers that wanted to flush them out right away. But the gangsters fought the Rangers. Now the Disciple and Stone alliances were established. The much smaller Supreme Gangsters needed an alliance of their own. Larry Hoover now felt the need to create his own countermeasure against the Black P-Stones in 1967. He adopted the same belief as the Disciples in keeping out of media outlets and having a code of silence, hence why the new Gangster Nation Alliance flew under the radar when it started in 1967 and through the rest of the 60s. The gangsters absorbed several black gangs that were opposition to Stones and didn't want to be disciples from as far south as 71st Street. All organizations that joined the Gangster Nation adopted the last name of Gangster to show allegiance. One thing people tend to get twisted is that the Supreme Gangsters were known as the High Supreme Gangsters. In reality, the High Supreme Gangsters were just a branch of Supreme Gangsters from 71st Street. Another branch on 71st was the Imperial Gangsters, once again another name that gets confused as a Supreme Gangster official title. In the month of September in the year 1968, Ike Taylor moved to the intersection of Gladys and Keeler in the K-Town section of Chicago's West Side, in the West Garfield Park neighborhood, after he was released from the Audie Home Detention Center. His family moved from Englewood to K-Town. When he arrived, he began spreading the word of the Gangster Nation to these young West Side youths that were mainly familiar with Vice Lords and Egyptian Cobras. King Ike recruited many youths in this area and established the very first Supreme Gangster branch in history. Ike appointed Robert Red Lawson to be his sergeant of arms, and this was the birth of the Gangster Disciples on the west side of Chicago, and it all started in 1968. This was also the beginning of the permanent settlement of Gangster Disciples in the southern portion of this community near the expressway. The West Side Supreme Gangsters gained quick popularity, especially after they absorbed the Black Pimps and the Jive 5 gangs by the 1970s. The Black Pimps were especially large in the West Garfield Park area, so this became a colossal move for the gangsters, turning them out. This gave the gangsters a major momentum boost, and they soon colonized the Henry Horner projects located in the near West Side neighborhood right away in 1967, putting the gangsters on the map in two West Side neighborhoods. There really weren't any Disciples or Stones on the west side, so this was prime opportunity. The only major rival to deal with was the Vice Lords. This how Gangster Disciples became so large in the Henry Horner projects until they were torn down. In the early 1970s, Ike Taylor was convicted of attempted murder and other charges after the shooting of Albert Harris. In the court case of People v. Taylor on December 24, 1974, Albert Harris was walking home from a friend's house and was down the street from where he lived. Harris stopped walking when he heard the clicking sound of a gun. He turned and claimed he saw Ike Taylor standing there holding a pistol. Harris said that Ike said, "It ain't nothing but a gangster thing." Harris then saw another man holding a shotgun in a doorway, then Henry Heron joined Taylor holding a pistol and Ronald Lawson on the other side of Taylor holding a shotgun. Harris then claimed that Taylor said, "You're busted," then shot Harris in the throat. The man with the shotgun in the doorway fired next and shot Harris in his right side. A fifth shooter suddenly showed up and shot Harris again with a 12-gauge shotgun in the face. Harris then turned to see Taylor, Heron, and Lawson standing side by side with flashing sparks coming from their guns. Harris dropped to the ground to crawl away, but then a sixth shooter appeared with a 12-gauge and shot Harris yet again. Harris managed to flee under a car as the men continued to open fire on the car, as Harris could hear all the pellets striking the vehicle that terrified him so much that he cried out for his mother to save him. His mother heard the frenzy of gunfire and her son cry out, then rushed to the scene as the men fled. Harris was blinded, was left with a difficulty speaking, lost 6 teeth, and was left with scars all over but survived the attack. According to court documents, Lawson was acquitted of the crime and the other 3 men not named were never found. Ike Taylor and Henry Heron were convicted and both men protested their innocence. Ike Taylor was able to get the aggravated battery charges removed, but the attempted murder charge stuck. In later years, Ike Taylor would become a positive leader and positive advocate for the growth and development concepts of the Gangster Disciples. The Supreme Gangsters made a conquest out of the West Side in 1967 and not only settled the near West Side and West Garfield Park. Gangsters also made their way east of Garfield Park and settled in the East Garfield Park community and in North Lawndale. Gangsters also landed in the West Humboldt Park community alongside the first blacks to settle south of Chicago Avenue in the West Humboldt Park community. Black Souls and Vice Lord groups were settling West Humboldt Park at the same time, and Supreme Gangsters especially warred with Black Souls for a number of years into the 1970s. But Black Souls would not gain territory in this community, but Supreme Gangsters remained and still have a deck in this community today as Gangster Disciples. Gangsters also made a large home in North Lawndale and East Garfield Park that is still active as Gangster Disciples today. In the year 1968, war began between the Disciples and Supreme Gangster allied gangs, especially with the Supreme Gangsters. Larry Hoover became the target for assassination attempts. He was shot on 2 occasions. Then, on September 4, 1968, a third attempt was made on him. On this day, Englewood was on high alert as Disciples, Gangsters, and Stones were packing guns and ready to shoot each other. At Parker High School, members of the Supreme Gangsters and Disciples were especially ready to get into drama against each other. Barron Disciple member James Highsmith and Disciple co-founder Leonard Longstreet entered Parker High School even though they weren't students. The two spotted Larry Hoover standing outside of the principal's office, and Highsmith walked past him with a smile as Longstreet shouted out, "Burn him." Highsmith pulled out a .32 pistol and shot Larry Hoover and 2 others nearby. No one was killed, but Highsmith was convicted of the shooting and sentenced to 1 to 5 years. During that fall season of 1968, the guns were blazing all over the South Side as Disciples, Gangsters, and Stones were at each other's throats as bodies were dropping. This led to a temporary truce between the 3 organizations that didn't last long, but it was an attempt to curtail the several acts of violence on the South Side. One thing to understand is that the leadership and founders did not want any more violence and were actually friends. This was a friendship of original Black P. Stones, Devil's Disciples, and Supreme Gangsters. They had no control of factions that would act in self-interest and started violence with factions of the rival group, starting the gang wars. The leaders and founders were not interested in war. The first main drug dealer and syndicate individual in Roseland was an individual nicknamed Brick. In the 95th Street area, black youths admired this older guy in his 40s as he drove around in expensive cars and had lots of money. Many black youths connected to gangs, especially the syndicate rangers, worked for Brick, moving his drugs around the community for a cut of the profits. To many of these youths, both rangers and disciples, they found Brick to be an undesirable, even though they often worked for him to make a little extra money. Brick was viewed as a problem for the black community, spreading drugs in the neighborhood. Brick would operate for some years, but his reign ended in 1968 when a 17-year-old youth ran him out. In the summer of 1968, 17-year-old Ulysses Floyd rose through the ranks of the syndicate Blackstone Rangers to the point where he was running the Loden Projects Rangers. In that summer of 1968, Andrew Howard of the Supreme Gangsters brought Ulysses Floyd to see Larry Hoover, the leader and founder of the Supreme Gangsters, to a meeting at 68th and Green in Englewood at a park. At this park, Ulysses Floyd agreed to join the Supreme Gangsters as a chief or Supreme Chief and established the Gangsters in Roseland at 95th Street and build from there. Floyd not only put the Gangsters in Roseland, his influence spread all the way up to 79th Street. After these, many syndicate rangers and disciples flipped to his branch of outlaw Supreme Gangsters that now established themselves very well in the northern Roseland area. Black migration was growing stronger by 1968 and advancing south of 95th Street as disciples, outlaw gangsters, and black P-Stones moved into the higher-numbered streets that would soon be known as the Wild Hundreds. After Floyd established the Outlaws, he ran Brick out of business as he had to leave the neighborhoods. Floyd was nearly executed by crooked police officers in the Dan Ryan Woods on behalf of Brick, but when they let Floyd go instead, Floyd pushed out Brick. Shortly after, Floyd and the gangsters realized how much money Brick was worth, and temptation was too strong for the gangsters to walk away from all that potential money. Therefore, they took over the drug operations. However, they gave back to the community unlike Brick and ran a better operation than Brick. Outlaw gangsters also worked well with disciples, and this brought an alliance in 1969 after the BGDN alliance was formed. In January of 1969, Larry Hoover was highly recognized by David Barksdale and Jeff Fort because the gangsters had risen to become the third largest outfit on the south side of the city. This is when Jeff Fort became interested in establishing an official alliance with Larry Hoover and the gangsters. Now this is where history gets tricky and has caused many disputes on the streets for many years on if Larry Hoover and the gangsters became Stones. Some will tell you he was a Stone and others will say no way. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. However, I will say this right now before we go into details: Larry Hoover was never a Stone, and I'll explain it all right now. In January of 1969, Larry Hoover went to Jeff Fort for a peaceful meeting to discuss an alliance. The two leaders agreed on just having an alliance that had no official title. It was simply a truce between gangsters and Stones, and not a merger in any which way. This alliance was not the same as the Black Disciple type alliance, or Gangster Nation type alliance, or like the Black P-Stone type alliance. This was an alliance that kept gangsters and Stones separate, but would still be governed by Jeff Fort and Larry Hoover supposedly as equals. Larry came up with the idea for him to rule this alliance alongside Jeff, but Jeff ended up declining this in the long run because in Jeff's mind nobody is his equal. The peace between them lasted close to a half year, but ended up going sour as Larry was seeing more and more how Jeff would not let him rule alongside him as an equal. Jeff also came up with the idea for a complete merger of gangster and Stone concept that he wanted to call the Gangster Stones, but Larry Hoover rejected the idea, especially since Jeff wouldn't let him rule as equals. This and a shooting in May of 1969 when the Stones shot at Supreme Gangsters near Larry Hoover's home were events that brought an end to this alliance. Here are the details of that shooting that pushed things over the edge between Stones and gangsters. On May 7, 1969, two Supreme Gangsters, Gregory Sanders and Ronald Vandergrift, were shot at by Black P-Stones at the corner of 69th and Halstead in the Englewood neighborhood. At the intersection of 69th and Green between 1:30 a.m. to 2. Ronald Vandergrift came across Lonnie King and Charlie Stone Smith, who were two members of the Double Six Kings, which was a Black P. Stone gang. Vandergrift knew Lonnie King, so he began walking and talking with him as they walked towards 69th and Halstead. Lonnie started telling Ronald that he did not belong around there and to stop coming around that neighborhood because Ronald was a supreme gangster. Lonnie had no idea about the gangster and BPS alliance, and somehow Ronald could not convince him of it. Charlie Stone Smith then came around the corner and joined Lonnie in telling Ronald he did not belong around there and to keep his gangsters out. Charlie was ruthless about it and only said it one time, then yanked out his revolver and shot at Ronald 2 times, striking him once in the groin area in his inner left thigh. After Ronald was shot, he ran to the other side of the street. Felix Murray and Gregory Sanders were nearby and fled the scene too. Ronald did not get far because of his wound and fell between 2 cars. Felix Murray then came to help Ronald, and as the 2 men took off, King and Smith kept shooting at them and grazed Murray. The 2 men ran 2 blocks away to the corner of 68th and Green, and that is where they met up with Charles Hoover at the family home of Larry Hoover. The 2 were then taken to the hospital and were treated for their wounds. The hospital called the police about the fact they were shot, but both men declined pressing any charges or naming their assailants according to court documents. On May 9th at about 4 p.m., Charles Hoover was at the corner of 68th and Halstead and saw the shooters Lonnie King and Charlie Smith. King and Smith told Hoover they were sorry and that they did not know Hoover and the Supreme Gangsters were allies. On May 11th, Vandergrift, King, Murray, Smith, Charles Hoover, and some others attended a reconciliation meeting at the Black P. Stone headquarters, where the shooting was declared an accident due to the fact that the shooters did not know Supreme Gangsters were now allies. According to court documents, Black P. Stone Ranger chiefs were the judges in this meeting. In June 1969, Ronald Vandergrift was picked up by CPD for jumping bail, marijuana possession, and 2 charges of aggravated battery according to court documents. Vandergrift made a deal with CPD and decided to testify all about the shooting and now press charges in exchange for leniency for his crimes. He also came to this decision because by then the Supreme Gangsters had now went back to war with the Stones and were now merged with the Disciples. This opened up a court case of People v. Smith on October 9, 1973, which was a joint indictment of Stephen Smith for an aggravated battery charge and was also being indicted on murder charges from June 2, 1969. He was 20 years old at the time and the leader of the Double Six Kings. In June of 1969, Larry Hoover had enough of the Stones and conferenced with David Barksdale instead. Larry Hoover's alliance with Jeff Fort as allies for a few months had gone sour, and now Hoover met with David Barksdale. The 2 groups established an alliance that had a title known as the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. The Black Gangster Disciple Nation consisted of the Gangster Nation, which was the Supreme Gangsters and their gangster allies. These gangsters were to be led by Larry Hoover. The Disciples were now known as Black Disciples, and this was the alliance of all the disciple gangs led by David Barksdale. Prince Old Timer was appointed the Prince of the Disciples, while Tennessee the Prince of the Gangsters. Again, this was still just an alliance, but it was a combined concept alliance, unlike the one between the Stones and the Gangsters. All disciple gangs and gangster gangs were all Black Gangster Disciples. Many disciples and gangsters just considered themselves BGDs or Black Gangster Disciples when this alliance was first established, and didn't even refer to themselves as Black Disciples or Gangsters. They fell in love with the BGD title. In June of 1969, Vice Lords, Black P. Stones, and BGDs all got together to form a coalition known as the Lord Stones and Disciples, or LSD. This was a unity of the gangs so they could march on the government and demand equal rights, better jobs, and about all the oppression and poverty in their neighborhoods. This coalition effectively slowed down gang violence between these 3 organizations even after CVL Inc. went defunct in the fall of 1970. For the rest of 1969, the LSD coalition really set aside a lot of gang wars as they marched on City Hall, universities, and everywhere. until finally in January of 1970 they achieved some success in bringing about the Chicago Plan, which was an agreement to implement the employment of minorities in Chicago's construction industry. The final agreement lists 3,000 jobs or training positions in 4 categories. But a coalition spokesman claimed that the actual final agreement called for 1,000 jobs in each category. It was soon discovered in the early 1970s that the Chicago Plan was failing about not producing like it should, and by October of 1973 the LSD coalition disbanded. In the year 1969, many South Side black youths were being bused into Senn High School on Chicago's far north side. This program was meant to provide South Side black students with better education opportunities. However, much of the student body at Senn was not accepting. This is when black Gangster Disciples were among bused-in students. Eventually, many of their families would settle in the area of Lawrence and Winthrop, which was the oldest black settlement in the neighborhood. The black Gangster Disciples now became a large and permanent part of the uptown neighborhood, as this was one of the first North Side settlements besides Cabrini Green projects. In the year 1970, the notorious 4848 building was built at Lawrence and Winthrop, that was built as a building for impoverished black families and was a Chicago Housing Authority apartment complex. The black Gangster Disciples moved into this building in 1970 as Lawrence and Winthrop was already their territory. In these buildings, the Disciples made lots of profits in drug trafficking until the building was torn down. In the year 1969, the Supreme Gangsters, Outlaw Supreme Gangsters, etc. began spreading into the West Pullman, Morgan Park, Riverdale, South Deering, and Pullman. This was due to the beginning of a major white flight pattern beginning on the far southwest side of Chicago. As this was beginning, there was major racial conflict between whites and African Americans that was not published. There were fights over using community resources, schools, and territories. In Riverdale, residents of the Altgeld Gardens public housing projects wanted to use more amenities from neighboring and more affluent communities like West Pullman and Pullman. This brought the black Gangster Disciples, both of disciple and gangster backgrounds, into these projects along with black pea stones. The Altgeld projects were now filled with both disciple groups and gangster groups. The BGDs were the strongest in the projects when they arrived in 1969, which is why GDs and BDs are so big in these buildings and remain there permanently. In the Pullman community, there was much anger over African Americans moving into the northern part of Pullman as of 1969 and attending white public schools. Greaser gangs and other white groups and even some white supremacists targeted African American migration, and racial outbursts happened which caused black Gangster Disciples to move into Pullman and permanently settle these streets. Black pea stones also arrived, and conflict between gangsters and stones would soon ensue. On the street of West Pullman, white flight began in 1969. Since the early 60s, African Americans had been residing in West Pullman, much to the objection of some of the white community, but they earned their keeps. By 1969, block-busting tactics took a toll on this community, causing a white flight exodus that was intense in the 1970s, and the community became impoverished and crime-filled. The black Gangster Disciples would arrive in 1969 to deal with racial prejudices, but soon focused their energy on the black pea stones. This began a permanent settlement of the Gangster Disciples in West Pullman. In the Morgan Park community, African Americans had been residing in the eastern part of the community east of Vincennes Avenue since the 1890s. Beginning in 1958, racial tensions began once the Dan Ryan Expressway removed a portion of this African American community, causing African American residents to move west of Vincennes. This brought racial conflict that ushered in the Blackstone Raiders gang that became large in the community until they went extinct a short time later. During most of the 60s, racial issues seemed to calm until 1969, when there were more programs offered on the far southwest side for African Americans to use white facilities and schools. This sparked protest and racial clashing, which ushered in the black Gangster Disciples into Morgan Park in 1969. Since then, the Gangster Disciples have been the dominating gang in Morgan Park up to present day, as they made their presence well known as soon as they arrived in 1969. In the year 1969, white flight had begun to take its toll in the Jeffrey Manor and Trumbull housing projects areas of the South Deering community. During this process, the majority white residents were angered over this. This began racial conflict in South Deering that was heavily unreported ever since the 1953 Trumbull Park Project racial riot. By 1969, the projects had become majority African American, but the neighborhood was majority white by a large margin. This was a call for the Black Gangster Disciples to move into the Trumbull Park Projects and Jeffrey Manor in 1969 to aid youths dealing with these racial conflicts. No other African American groups were settling these areas, therefore, the BGDs were the ones that assisted the African American community of South Deering. This went on all through the 1970s, as BGDs were the only group that were part of the Supreme Gangsters' Gangster Nation blueprint. When conservative vice lords, Latin kings, Latin counts and Spanish vice lords arrived in the early 1980s, the BGDs battled them all until CVLs and SVLs left the neighborhood. The Jeffrey Manor GDs especially have a strong and legendary legacy that remains permanent. Before the 1970s, Cabrini Green was run by various different gangs with a good number of Cobra Stones and disciples running some of the buildings or parts of buildings. In the early 1970s, a bid for domination of these projects began and first caught wind in the news when 2 police officers were shot dead by snipers on the rooftop of one of the project buildings. There was an existing war between Black Deuces and Cobra Stones that prompted police to investigate. This is how serious this war was becoming. In 1971, Richard Strong, the Cabrini Green disciple founder, started a group called the BLAC. KS, which was a civil rights group that aimed to help the people of Cabrini Green facing injustices. Eventually, the BLACKS and the Deuces would merge together, then eventually merge into the Disciples. In the early 1970s, investigations into street gangs using government funding for illegal activities came to a close, as they now had evidence to convict high-ranking gang members from the Black P Stones. In 1971, top leaders of the Black P Stones were officially charged, and by 1972 Jeff Fort was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The investigations didn't stop with the Stones though. Investigators went after the vice lords and shut down their legit businesses, then they aimed their crosshairs at the Black Gangster Disciples. Authorities ended up getting Mingo to testify before the grand jury against his own organization. However, no charges were brought upon the Disciples, but government funding was cut off. Stones and vice lords had members testify against their own gangs too in these proceedings, and caused vice lords and Stones to face prison time, but Mingo's testimony failed to convict anyone. Instead, Mingo was severely beaten on the streets by the Disciples for snitching on his own kind. The same exact money that convicted the Stones somehow didn't get the Disciples convicted, even though both groups were technically mismanaging funds. It seemed like the government just had it out for the Stones more. Not only that, the Disciples didn't seek out this money, it was kind of forced on them as equal payment to them to not favor Stones. Disciples weren't big with talking to the media and stayed out of the spotlight unlike the Stones, so perhaps this helped their case and kept them less of a target of the government. In the year 1971, the Disciples began to fall into disorganization, and groups of disciples began not honoring the BGDN and even feuded with other disciple groups. There were those that wanted to overthrow Larry Hoover, and there were others that were disciples that didn't like the gangsters because of the old war with the gangsters. There were also some groups that had self-interest in mind, rebelling against leadership. A harsh conviction did come down on the BGDs in 1973. On February 26, 1973, Larry Hoover ordered the death of William Pookie Young, a 19-year-old drug dealer in the neighborhood that stole drugs and money from the BGDs. Andrew Howard killed him on behalf of Hoover, and it all happened at 68th and Union in the Englewood neighborhood in an alley. Young was shot 6 times in the head. On March 16th, both men were arrested and charged with the murder. By November 5, 1973, Hoover and Howard were sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison in Statesville Correctional Facility in Crest Hill, Illinois. As Larry Hoover was now sitting in prison, David Barksdale's health was declining. Since he was shot in 1970, his kidneys needed to be replaced, and his brother was the donor of a kidney. David Barksdale did not live like he got a new kidney against doctor orders, and now his health was declining. David Barksdale's kidneys were slowly shutting down. David Barksdale succumbed to his illness and died on September 2, 1974. The fond memory would live on of King David as a positive leader that truly worked to better lives for disciples and many people in his communities. David Barksdale was no drug dealer, he was no killer, or at least not on record he was no killer, he was barely even a criminal. He was the king of the disciples, but when you look at his old rap sheet you really couldn't tell. David wasn't full of money and power, and he didn't even make money like Larry did. On record he was a small-time hustler that committed petty crimes, and he had no real felonies on his record. After Barksdale's passing in 1974, he was dearly missed, especially by the gangster gangs allied with the BGDN. Most of the disciples were also very mournful and wanted to continue growing a closer unity with the gangsters. A rumor circulated that Larry Hoover thought he was rightfully due the position of king of black gangster disciples, causing some groups of BGDs to fight among themselves, as some wanted to kill Larry Hoover because of this, while others supported this, and now violence brewed among groups of disciples and gangsters, while the main disciples and main gangsters had to work together to stop the damage of this rumor. It was also at this time that disciples that still held grudges against the gangsters could make moves against gangsters now that Barksdale had passed away. Chaos was brewing within the BGDN. In the year 1975, black families began to settle in the Rogers Park neighborhood along Howard Street and in the Jonquil and Juneway Terrace apartments. These apartments were known to be seedy, cheap, deteriorated, and full of crime. Black gangster disciples settled here to assist the black community here with unfair conditions, but would soon clash with black P-stones that settled here too. During all these wars, Larry Hoover always tried to look for ways to end violence between all the gangs. His overall grand vision was for there to be peace among the nations, and if there needed to be war, he wanted it controlled exactly like how the Italian mafia controls their gang wars. Larry never liked messy wars and uncontrolled bloodshed. He became less and less fond of violence and instead wanted to see young black men lead more refined lives. Larry Hoover showed power in Statesville Prison in April of 1978 when he got together with members of the Black Gangster Disciples, Black Souls, Vice Lords, Black P-stones, and Mickey Cobras, and organized a work stoppage strike against foul food that was being served to inmates, making them sick. During this strike, Larry Hoover also got together with leaders of several rival and allied organizations from all over the city in this prison. Now that they showed unity by assembling this work stoppage, the unity was taken further, or perhaps it was arranged while creating the stoppage in the first place. Regardless of when exactly it happened, the creation of the Folk and People Alliances happened in April of 1978, stemming from this work stoppage protest. This organizing led to another big sit-down with members of allied and enemy nations to discuss how to control the gang wars in the prison system. He proposed two rival coalitions that all major gangs would follow that could be controlled by negotiations between the leaders of each of these coalitions, just like how the Italian mafia organizes their gang wars between families. For Larry's own organization and his own allies, he assembled the Folk Alliance, which united Black Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, Ashland Vikings, Ambrose, 2-6, Satan Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, Spanish Cobras, Imperial Gangsters, Latin Eagles, Simon City Royals, and Insane Popes to have complete peace among each other and work together. The opposition agreed to this and assembled their own coalition called the People Alliance. The People Alliance was assembled by the Black P-stones, Vice Lords, and Latin Kings as they allied with Latin Counts, Bishops, Mickey Cobras, for Corner Hustlers, Insane Unknowns, Spanish Lords, and Puerto Rican Stones. This became a very effective coalition in the prison system and drastically reduced violence between gangsters and BDs, keeping BGDN continuing. Right after Larry assembled the Folk and People Alliances, he was then out of Statesville Prison and sent to Pontiac Prison in Pontiac, Illinois. When Larry got to this prison, he saw how poorly prisoners were treated by prison staff. The prison was overcrowded, and this resulted in squalid conditions. Larry Hoover organized the Brothers of the Struggle movement that involved high-ranking Black Gangster Disciples, Black Souls, Vice Lords, Black P-stones, and Mickey Cobras. These 17 inmates raised up a rebellion on July 22, 1978, to overthrow the prison and bring mass destruction. In the wake of the intense violence, 3 correctional officers were stabbed to death. When the 17 men were out on trial, they were found not guilty. During his trials that went on until 1981, Larry Hoover was in segregation away from other inmates initially. In the year 1978, Don Smoke and Junior Hope brought the Black Gangster Disciples to the Cabrini Green projects. The story on this began in 1978 when these men met up with Larry Hoover in Statesville. After this, Smoke got out of prison and brought heroin mass distribution to the projects. From the start, Smoke and Little John were bringing a larger drug trade to these projects beginning in 1978 that was previously small and not well organized. In Cabrini Green, there were just disciples that favored the BGD banner. While Smoke was in with Larry, Larry asked if Smoke would become BGD and side with the gangsters. Smoke agreed and joined BGD. Smoke then got in contact with Little John, who was on the streets of Cabrini, and now got word that Cabrini Green disciples would become gangster. This would absorb up the Black Deuces and the BLACKS. This is the whole story of how the Gangster Disciples took over the majority of Cabrini Green. It all started in 1978, but had roots going back to 1961. There was solid peace between gangsters and BDs from late 1978 until late 1979, until a flare-up happened in Statesville, but got patched up only to return a year later. In late 1980, another flare-up began again and heightened on January 29, 1981, when an incident happened at Statesville after groups of Black disciples became aggressive with gangsters. In Statesville Prison Unit B, Black disciple gang member George Bailey resided in this unit along with members of the gangsters. Bailey was allowed a privileged duty known as cell house help, which allowed inmates to roam freely in the cell block without cuffs or escort by guards, according to court documents. Black Gangster Disciple leader Ernest Smokey Wilson disapproved of Black disciples being cell house helpers and declared that all BDs should either resign from this position or flip to becoming part of the gangsters. Wilson even held a meeting in that unit for BGDs and BDs to attend to lay out the rules. 3 BDs, including Bailey, were in attendance, and 2 of those 3 BDs resigned from that position and listened to Wilson, according to court documents, but Bailey would not drop the position. The BDs did not like this rule that Wilson imposed, and for 2 weeks straight they chanted BD power every night around 8 p.m. according to court documents. Wilson then had a meeting with Dirk Acklin, who was a BD leader, to express Wilson's dissatisfaction of this revolt from the BDs. But apparently it got nowhere, so Wilson picked a fist fight with Bailey, which got Wilson thrown in segregation. On January 29th, he was returned to his unit and met with fellow BGDs to plot the murder of Bailey. The BGDs obtained an aluminum bat, which ended up in the hands of Fred Bobo Collins. Later that day, Collins struck Bailey in the head with the bat repeatedly, which caused Bailey to be hospitalized, and on February 5, 1981, Bailey died according to court documents. After this incident in Statesville in 1981, Dirk Acklin gained control of the Black disciples in prison and brought peace to the BGDN. However, it was also decided that the BGDN would be no more, and that being BGD just meant to be part of the gangsters. Several disciples all over the city simply represented that they were BGDs, instead hollering that they were disciples or Black disciples. When this reorganization happened, all those many disciple decks that mainly just claimed BGD went under the gangsters, and now it was official that they were BGD with Larry Hoover and the gangsters. Those that mainly identified only as disciple and or as Black disciple went with the BDs on the streets. This was not a split, this was just a reorganizing. However, it was a change for those disciples that were mainly claiming BGD since 1969, as they would now be with Hoover and the gangsters. That was really the only change, but this change was colossal because the amount of disciples that cherished the BGD banner was the large majority of disciples, and this is how the Gangster Disciples became the largest gang in the city. In the same year of 1981, Black Gangster Disciples were released as well, that assured the reorganization was finalized for the BGD side of things. Basically, there was a big toss-up in 1981 between BGDN gangs to side with either gangsters or disciples, and sections had to turn in their decision to be with the gangsters or the disciples. The majority of the founding members of the disciples chose to go with BGD, and they feel they are the true disciples. I have given credit to the Gangster Disciples being founded in 1958 because of the large amount of original disciples that have felt this is the true path. There is much debate on the streets about who is more righteous, GD or BD, that stems from this history. Robert Cole Black Doherty's was released from prison in 1981 and was appointed by Larry Hoover to come to the Stateway Gardens projects and the Robert Taylor projects and flip many BGDN members into BGD members as the gangsters took over the area of Pershing Road to 43rd Street in the Robert Taylors and the majority of the Stateway Gardens projects. At the same time, Mickey Bull Johnson brought the rest of the BGDN into the Black Disciples in the Robert Taylors and Stateway Gardens. The Dell Vikings were the dominant gang in both sets of projects until most of them flipped to Black Disciples while some others flipped to BGD. The Black Gangster Disciples were now very strong in the public housing buildings, and there were over 400 members in Cabrini Green alone in 1981. This was also the year the lucrative Gangster Disciple and Black Disciple drug operations began in the Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens that would become legendary in later years. Also in the year 1981, Larry Hoover began to draw the BGDs into politics as he established bylaws for BGDs not to harm prison guards or any prison staff unless ordered to do so. This was also the year the BGDs restructured, which brought new titles for higher-up members, and this is when Larry Hoover no longer wanted the title of king and instead became the chairman. At this stage, Hoover was transitioning more out of the role as a crime boss and was looking for further reform not only for himself, but also for the BGDs. In 1982, Larry Hoover stepped up his organization as he established Brothers of the Struggle as official, and this time only for BGDs. He sent out memos to top leaders geared toward bettering the organization and encouraging members to refine themselves. In the year 1986, the L. Rookins faced indictment that caused some harm to their organization. After this happened, the BGDs experienced a major boost in numbers and now outnumbered L. Rookins' Black Peachstones in the city. This involved the BGDs becoming the new dominating force over the drug trade after the Stones ran it for nearly 20 years. This was also the year that Junior Hope was running all the street operations for the BGDs. In March of 1987, Larry Hoover was seen as becoming reformed, especially after his 1981 policy about not harming prison staff. This all granted him a transfer to Vienna Correctional Center in Vienna, Illinois, which is a minimum security prison. It was in this prison where Larry Hoover now conducted business easier since security was much lower, but his business was not criminal kingpin business focused on dealing drugs, etc. His work was more political and how to teach members the message of reform. After Larry Hoover was transferred to a minimum security facility, all hell broke loose in Statesville and in Pontiac Prison, as now Larry was no longer around to smooth things over. At Pontiac Prison, members of the BGDs conspired to murder Superintendent Robert Taylor for the purpose of avenging mistreatment against BGD members by prison staff. These BGDs wanted revenge for the death of Billy Zodiac Jones and Kirk Williams, who both died while choking on cocaine they were trying to conceal. When BGD Harry Martin was apprehended and charged for the murder, he claimed Larry Hoover gave him the order to kill this prison staff member. Upon investigation, it was proven Larry had no ties to this. However, the damage was done because Martin gave up lots of other information about how the BGDs were ran and how they governed, and this led to other investigations. At the time this was happening, Larry Hoover was working on a positive program he created that was aimed at steering the BGDs further away from being a criminal organization. He created Better Growth and Development and declared BGD stood for those words. Better growth and development concepts were to help GDs better themselves and to help better their community instead of fueling the problems that existed in their neighborhoods. It was also a way for BGDs to become legitimately successful and become productive men and women of society. Better Growth and Development was not official and was not even released to the public at this time. In the year 1988, Michael G. took over leadership of all street operations of the Black Gangster Disciples. In the year 1989, the drug trade became increasingly competitive in the Englewood neighborhood between BGDs and BDs, and this resulted in a string of violent shootings between these gangs that year that left some bad feelings between BGDs and BDs in Englewood. This is when young members of the BGDs started referring to themselves as GDs or Gangster Disciples, dropping the black out of their name to show no love for BDs, but this was not the official name of the organization yet. In the year 1990, Cold Black was running the BGDs, but only for a short time in that year. This was also the year that Better Growth and Development was finally shared for the first time among trusted BGD heads. It was not made public or official yet. In the summer of 1991, BGDs gunned down Mickey Bull. After that happened, the Black Disciples got revenge on August 7, 1991, by gunning down multiple members of the BGDs in Englewood. During this shooting, a group of BGDs from 66th Street started calling themselves Gangster Disciples, dropping the B or Black out of their name. In court documents, the men represented GD and BDs acknowledged them as GDs and not as BGDs. As this violence between BGDs and BDs ensued in 1991, Larry Hoover was trying to demonstrate to many of his members the growth and development ways. The name was slightly changed, leaving out the better part that was part of the original 1987 plan. This was another step toward GD becoming the new ways. However, growth and development had nothing to do with the name change or the violence. It was purely coincidental because the initials of growth and development were GD. Between 1991 to 1994, the wars between BGDs and BDs were increasing as members of each gang couldn't hardly walk around the neighborhood without getting shot at by each other. During this time, more and more Englewood BGDs began to call themselves GDs, and more were dropping the B, and now more BGDs citywide were dropping the B. Gangster Disciples made a slow progression, moving into the Marquette Park neighborhood in the late 1980s until they established a full-fledged chapter by 1991 after migrating from West Englewood. The GDs also moved north of 59th Street into the Gage Park neighborhood, where they recruited Mexican youths that were part of the G-Town 26 group. This brought about the first major non-black sections of GDs operating in Gage Park. In the year 1992, these Gage Park GDs were able to spread to the suburb of Cicero, creating the Hell Zone GDs. In 1993, the BDs and BGDs reached some peace, but it only lasted a year or two, then war became permanent in 1994. 1993 was the year Growth and Development became official and was publicly released. 1994 was the year that BGDs officially became Gangster Disciples. Some members still used BGD until 1994, including Gator, that went before the White House in January of 1994. And spoke about better growth and development, but this was the last time BGD name was used in public. By 1993, the Gangster Disciples were trying a new political move known as 21st Century VOTE, which was an attempt to get Gangster Disciple members into politics. To the public, it was meant to help rehab neighborhoods and bring about positive change, but critics and law enforcement saw it as a way to help expand Gangster Disciple illegal operations. At that same time in 1993, Larry Hoover was trying to get out of prison and was up for parole. Over 10,000 members of the Gangster Disciples gathered at a large picnic in Kankakee, Illinois, where Larry Hoover gave a speech to all the GDs there. He further expanded on growth and development, which was the new term Larry Hoover wanted to use to replace the Gangster Disciples term. As I said before, growth and development concepts were to help GDs better themselves and to help better their community instead of fueling the problems that existed in their neighborhoods. Afterward, there was a flood of letters to Governor Jim Ryan pleading with him to allow the parole of Larry Hoover. However, Larry Hoover was denied parole. Things only got worse in 1995 when the Chicago police launched Operation Headache, which took down 39 high-ranking members of the Gangster Disciples, including Larry Hoover and Andrew Howard, who had been on parole since 1992. Larry Hoover was brought up on several drug conspiracy charges that dated all the way back to 1970, which was the time when the Gangsters and Disciples started to operate a major drug cartel, mostly of cocaine and heroin. Hoover and several of his top generals and lieutenants were being arraigned on charges of supplying small-time dealers, extorting money, and running their own drug cartel that was worth millions of dollars. By the end of the trials in 1997, Larry Hoover was transferred to United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, which is a super maximum security prison, which effectively cut off over 95% of Hoover's communication with the outside world. During the 1990s, recruitment of Hispanics and whites exploded mainly in the suburbs, as the Gangster Disciples appeared to be a mixed-race organization out the burbs. But in the city it was still a vast majority black organization, besides some territory in the uptown area and some other north side areas. Starting in the late 1980s and escalating in the early 1990s, the Gangster Disciples were operating highly sophisticated crack cocaine operations in the Robert Taylor homes, Cabrini Green high-rise and low-rises, Dearborn Homes mid-rises, and the Stateway Gardens. The GDs ran most of the buildings within these public housing complexes and began a $100 million a year crack cocaine operation just in Cabrini Green alone. Soldiers in the organization worked around the clock 24 hours a day serving crack cocaine as they worked in shifts. The GDs ran public housing project buildings with an iron fist, as they had armed security that even patted down residents as they came home. GDs also imposed a curfew on residents after hours so they could control the drug trade more efficiently during peak hours, which was later at nights. Rules were very strict, especially in Cabrini Green, where gangsters were ordered to meet in the courtyard each night to do exercises just like in the military. There was no tolerance for disobeying any rules, and refusing to work your shifts or members were severely beaten or even killed for refusing to do security. GDs were heavily armed in the public housing projects with automatic weapons as they patrolled the project hallways. The drug sales in the public housing developments gave the Gangster Disciples a massive boost in the overall growth and developing of their organization. The GDs took advantage of the city and CHA's lack of interest in the public housing high-rises. There were young kids living in the projects, poor and struggling in life. The GDs recruited them and turned them into soldiers that were paid and fed while no one else cared. Drug addicts had already taken over the projects since the 1960s. The GDs were there to feed their need, and all of this was neglected by the city. It makes you wonder who the bad guy really is. The city and police neglected these developments, and the GDs came into a place no one cared about. Before the demolition of the Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor Homes housing projects in the 1990s and 2000s, the GDs were pulling in well over $100 million in drug profits on a yearly basis in these buildings. The organization eventually swelled to over 35,000 members. The Gangster Disciple history is more than just drugs and killing. There is also an activism side of this organization that has been rooted deep since the 1960s. For many years, the Gangster Disciples have preached to young disciples to keep their lives in order and to live as good men to their families and their community. Many of the older members that once were convicted of murders and other serious crimes have become outspoken about true leadership and developing young black men into productive members of society. The BOS message is still strong today in the hearts of many, but sadly many younger members have lost that message and don't even know who Larry Hoover is. In present years, the Gangster Disciples are divided into warring factions that often hate each other more than they do BDs and people mobs. There is violent and uncontrollable killing with no structure for these decks all over the city and suburbs.